Great you're here, Michel Bauwens. Could you please introduce yourself and give us an idea of what you're currently working on? What is your focus?
All right, so my name is Michel Bauwens. I'm Belgian. I'm a father of 4 children. And I created about 10 years ago the Foundation for Peer-to-Peer Alternatives. And the basic idea behind it is that through network technology we're now able to scale human cooperation at a global level. So through global open source communities, people sharing knowledge on a global basis, and combining this with relocalized manufacturing, relocalized production, closer to where people live and need it. And we basically study how this works. So who's doing it, how are they doing it, how they're governing themselves, they're inventing new currencies, how does that work, what are the property arrangements. And the aim is to create a world that creates abundance, so immaterial resources as abundant, so don't make them artificially scarce. And things that are scarce, natural resources, have to be managed in that way. So we have to recognize planetary boundaries and material limits. And so how can we develop modes of production, modes of value creation and value distribution that actually embody this immediately, and not what we do today is we extract value from people and nature, and then we try to balance it out after. And that system, after 400 years, it's done with. It's no longer working, it's destroying our planet, and it's creating too much inequality and all the social tensions that come with it. So we need to change.
Okay, so we are already digging right into it, because that's what we also would like to talk about, like changing the game and about transformation. But before getting into detail, what's your understanding, your ideas, your feeling about transformation? What do you understand?
Yes, so the basic idea is that, to compare with today we think value is created in the market. Every other form of value is ignored. And then that market value, in the best of cases, is redistributed. We think value is created by everyone. Every citizen is productive. You are productive when you bring up your children. You're productive when you make your community more alive and more dynamic. And so we want to move from an idea of labor as a commodity, so labor as a market good, which is basically saying our bodies are for sale or for rent, to a system of contribution. So people have their passionate engagements. They want to do something good for the people around them. And so we create communities around these common goals, common objects. We create shared resources. And then we think about, well, how do we best interact with the market and the state as commoners, creating that common value. So it's basically about recognizing every form of contribution, social contribution. And ecologically, it's about, how can we use our resources responsibly? So we have to lighten our, sorry for the difficult words, thermodynamic load on the planet. So matter and energy. And the best way to do that is by mutualization. So that's what the commons is about. Peer-to-peer, we create commons. And commons are shared resources that are managed by their stakeholder communities according to their own rules and norms. So it's not the state, it's not the market, even though they interact with it. Why is this interesting? Because if you have a non-profit car sharing agreement, you can have 100 cars for 1,000 people. Instead of in a private way, where you have 95% of the time the cars are idle. And so you're basically using only 1/5 of matter and energy for the same service. So we're not talking about like making people belt tightening. No, we are talking about having the same services in a much more relational way, much more humanly rich way, because we are governing these resources ourselves. But at the same time preserving our natural environment for the next generations and for all other beings on the planet.
So you have already touched upon many systemic things we are currently facing. So when we talk about transformation, we would like to answer you some specific questions on different levels of transformation. So let's start with the systemic one. How would you describe in a nutshell the system we are currently living in?
Yeah.
and what its problem is.
Okay, so now we have to simplify it, of course. We have market, capital, we have the state, and we have the nation. Yeah, the nation is what's left of community after capitalism has destroyed local community, because we used to live in very tight local communities, and that has been disbanded. And so the way the balance was working until recently was that, you know, we do have these pendulum swings from market focus to state focus, market focus, state focus. So the market wants to liberate itself from constraints, but by doing that creates more inequality and more ecological problems, and then the nation reacts and pressures the state to re-regulate the market. And this swing has been like 200 years, every 30 years. And in England they call it lib-lab, you know, liberal versus labor. And that doesn't work anymore, because today capital is transnational. So no matter how much noise you make at a nation-state level, because now we are in that moment where you have the social populists, Syriza and Comu, Corbyn, Sanders, and we have the national populists, the right-wing national populists, Trump, Brexit, Front National. So we are in this moment where, you know, too much market liberation has led to imbalance. But we can't restore it at the same level. So this is a real systemic issue. We cannot solve it within the logic that we have. So what we need to do today is to reconfigure these things. It's not about abolishing everything and saying this is a total new system. No, it's about saying today what should be central is the commons. Productive citizens in communities creating shared resources. They are creating the value by contributing code, design, urban gardening, you know, whatever it is that people are doing. And then we should have an ethical and generative market form that doesn't destroy and impoverish humans and natural resources, but generate more value for them. And then we should have a state form, you know, the common good institutions, if you like, that facilitate, empower, not bureaucratize and disempower. And this is the challenge. It's not about changing everything from the ground up. It's about reconfiguring the logic of what exists in a new way. And of course it's not easy, because we have to transform civil society, we have to transform the market and the state at the same time. This is a huge challenge, of course. And the way I see how we can do that, in the first instance, it's seed forms, subversive constructionism. Yeah? So we are not in a period where it's enough just to demand and fight and resist. No, we have to propose. And to propose, we actually have to do it ourselves. So we need a very strong prefigurative action. And that probably brings you to the next question, because that's also internal, right? It's not just about saying, let's change the outer world. We also need to change both individually, internally, in our capacity to relate to each other, and in our capacity to create fields of cooperation. You know, like when you're in a group, it's not just you and my relationship with you, it's also something that exists because we're together, and that we cannot reduce to just you and me interacting. There is a capacity there, and you have good groups and bad groups, and how do you do that?
So we're still going to dig a bit deeper there. So, like, maybe to stay a little bit on the systemic level still. So you already like started to answering the next question, which would be like, so in which way you said transformation should take place, but where is it already like taking place? Where do you see it? And which of these changes or the crumbling of the old system, where do you see like makes it hopeful for you, or where do you see challenges? There is a change happening, but it's not might not even be for the good.
So I'm surprisingly, I'm quite optimistic, because I see so much change happening at the grassroots level. And I just did a study confirming this. You know, I had the intuition, but now I can say with more confidence that this is actually happening. So we were asked by the city of Ghent, which is a progressive city in the north of Flanders, with a long history of, you know, grassroots traditions. It was a medieval commune managed by the guilds. It was a Calvinistic republic fighting against the Catholic emperor. It was the birth of the labor movement in Belgium with the textile workers. So it has a special, so it's not run-of-the-mill, I admit. But anyway, so in this city, we saw that there were 50 urban commons projects in 2006, but 500 in 2016. And actually what we discovered was that every provisioning system, so every human need, can today, if you want, be fulfilled in another way. So you can choose the public way, public housing, social housing, which has dramatically declined in the neoliberal period, so it's not so much available. You can do private housing, which has become unaffordable for 2/3 of young people today. So there's a loss of 2/3 of the amount of people able to buy a house when they're young. But you can also say, okay, I'll join your community land trust, I'll join a housing co-op, and I'll do co-housing. So the bricks, the houses, and the services in the house can be mutualized today in Ghent. You can do that for food. 10% of the food provisioning is already being done by community support agriculture, urban-based gardening, and different collective purchasing groups. You can do that for mobility. There's a non-profit car sharing project. There's even an electric car sharing project. So wherever you look, you can see that citizens are already reorganizing the basic way in which they look at production. And it's entirely different. There's no more producers and consumers. They are creating ecosystems. Yeah. So a group of consumers connects with a group of ecological farmers and say, okay, how can we work together? We want food, you need a stable income. How can we do this? Not like, how can I sell you more and more? Or how can I buy it as cheaply as possible, right? So it's from this kind of individualistic or collective egoistic point of view to a common good point of view. Like, we need food for sure. How can we do this in the best way so that everybody profits from it? Or benefit, I should say. Everybody benefits from it.
We would like to ask you a personal question that touches down on your own practice as an activist, because you seem to have been able to really establish a more or less sustainable style of creating your own activism, having your family life, doing research and all of that. So if you look at other people that are working in the field of commons, very often it seems to us that they are extremely busy. They are under pressure also, right?
Right.
So what keeps you going? What motivates
so
you?
I should first of all say, I don't want to be idealized because I'm under pressure too. I work way too hard, which I think goes together with the passionate engagement. And that's dangerous, because it's precisely because you like it that you want to do more of it, and you can do too much of it, right? So usually activists get sad because they are just working too hard. It's like so. It took me a long time. I've been very precarious for about 7 years. I had no business model, but then slowly things started working out. So now we are working with 12 people. And we organize ourselves in life pods, and this is, I think, very important. A life pod is a group of people who care for each other. We have 2 groups of 6, and it's not that we're rich enough to give each other money, so it's not in that kind of collectivism. It's more like, okay, we're 6, each of us needs an income, and so when something comes in, consulting project, a research funding, a subsidy, a lecture invitation, let's make sure that everybody can make a livelihood. And so just by looking at it, things happen. So I think that's a good part. The other thing, and I'm not sure that's the solution for everyone, but it works for me, is I happen to marry a Thai wife, and to be able to live part of the year in a country where the cost of living is less. I can combine periods of high activity. That's what happens with the 6 months I'm in Europe. Work too much like everybody else. But then I know for 6 months I'll be able to think, to read, to spend a lot of time with my children. And so I don't have the balance every single day of my life. It's more over the year. I try to, to design my life that at least over the year I can recuperate. Yeah. And I think that's the truth for more and more people. And this is how our social security system should change. I'm thinking we're all becoming creative people. We're all becoming like actors, right? So an actor is somebody who will work 14 hours a day while he's making a movie. It's very hard, it's very tough, it's exhausting. But then, okay, the film is over. You have time to go on holiday, read a few scenarios, decide what's your next project. And so this kind of pulsation, I think, is what most people today would need. Because if you're a worker doing something that's meaningless under subordination, you're not going to be happy. So you're happy when your day is over at 4. But when you're engaged and passionate about it, and you believe in what you're doing, the problem is the opposite. Like, when do I stop? And of course, if on top of it you're precarious, like I want to stop, but I can't stop because I need to, I need to feed my family. But let's stop thinking about the working week, for example. That doesn't work for people, I think. I mean, it's fine. I'm not against it for the people who still work in, the classic salary system. But for the increasing number of autonomous workers, project-based workers, nomadic workers, digital nomads, all the people who have precarious lifestyles, we need something else. We need, and I call it common fare instead of welfare. So how, as commoners, how do we manage the risk of our life and, pensions and this is where my other work comes in with SMART. It's a labor mutual. So we pay 2% of our income to a mutual guarantee fund. And so when we send out an invoice to our clients, we get paid immediately by the common fund. And then SMART goes after the payment of our invoices. And then we convert our invoices into a salary, which means we get access to pensions and healthcare and unemployment. And so I think we also need to abolish this division between, fixed salary workers and precarious workers. There's one working class, if you like. Maybe it's a bit of an old world, but anyway, you know what I mean. People who work for a living, there should be no difference. We should be equally protected.
So you already talked about like some kind of hacks in the system on a systemic level, but also on the organizational level. So for example, like how should the state or the welfare system change, but how could or should organizations change? Be they commercial, like big enterprises or small enterprises, or other maybe organizational forms in the system, or how they are working right now, and then later coming to a more personal level?
Well, so the first thing is, we need to change our orientation from profit maximization to benefit maximization. So we should be generative, which means, mission-driven, purpose-driven, impact-driven, whatever, but not profit. Profit is a means to an end. The surplus we use to reinvest in our goal. And I think in general for that, cooperative forms are more conducive to that. But I don't want to worship one particular legal form. It's the underlying logic that matters, right? So, and that means that our companies cannot be managed by finance. So we need a wall between purpose and capital. That's the second thing I would say. But I'm not against integrating, ethical finance, generative capital in a multi-stakeholder governance model. And there's one that exists called Fair Shares. It's very elaborate. It's a UK-based proposal, and it's so it's a number of shares for the funders, founders, workers, and users. Every group has a representation in the collective. So it's not one man, one vote like a classic cooperative, it's a multi-stakeholder system. So there's not one system. You have to think, design, what's your purpose, and what's the best governance and property for that purpose. And sometimes you need to be careful about it. I give you an example. In Sweden, in Malmö, there was a big project around waste recycling. Yeah, and what they did was like full democracy in maker spaces, and then getting refugees and immigrants to work with it. They didn't come because the people in the maker spaces are all people with white skin and highly educated, and they have a high social capital, but these other people didn't, and so they didn't feel at ease. So they change into a multi-stakeholder system where the NGOs and the refugee organizations have a stake in the collective governance, and suddenly then they come. You have to be flexible. It's, different people, different cultures have different sensitivities about status and what else can I say? I think that's already, so purpose-driven, be careful about what kind of capital you have. You need generative capital. Yeah, you need slow capital. You don't need extractive capital. Which means, generating coalitions of cities, unions, cooperatives, ethical finance, to do these kind of alternative projects. The commons is good because the commons are by definition self-governed. And if you look at the open source economy and the urban commons economy, which I studied in Ghent, there is a productive community managing its contributory system. So usually, if you look at open source, you have maintainers, people who protect the quality of the work but don't tell anybody what to do. Yeah. Then you have infrastructural organizations behind it. So the Wikipedia has the Wikimedia Foundation. Linux has a Linux Foundation. And the urban commons that I studied had these same type of organizations behind them. And then you have generative companies that emerge out of these commons to create livelihoods. And so these three have to be somehow integrated in an ecosystem. Yeah, they are to remain separate. It's like church and state. It's better you don't mix them. So you have one open source community, but it's open to all entrepreneurs. Yeah, but you can have rules, reciprocity-based rules, but it has to be open. Everybody can benefit from these commons. So it shouldn't be one thing. It should be one commons and many, many, many entities working together on the basis of these commons and creating surplus value for these commons, right? And then you have a managing organization which should be democratic, making sure that the ecosystem keeps working over time.
Mm-hmm. Can I maybe ask you a question about the commons, because you seem to be very advanced in your research and in your own understanding of the commons. If we look here in Germany, it seems that this whole notion of the commons is something that is very vague for people. Yeah. It's something they can hardly grasp. Also, we do not really have a proper term to fully translate what you call commons in German. There is a term that is, from a long time ago, I would say, and that has no meaning for most of the people nowadays. So my question to you is, as a commons advocate, where to start with explaining people about the commons and that they have a natural right to the commons, and also reaching out to the local administration to let them know that they basically have to start with the commons if they really want to build sustainable structures.
It's always good if you can to start from their own experience, and of course the difficulty we have in the West is that capitalism has abolished most of the commons. In the legal Napoleonic, the civil law, there's no commons. They just totally ignore it. It's private or public. So in our consciousness, the commons has completely disappeared. Because before capitalism, we had class societies, but actually most of the people were connected to their means of production. Farmers had their land, the land of the Lord, and the land of the commons. Guilds had their own machinery, right? And that has changed. So everything that was mutual has been demutualized. So it's normal that people don't realize that what the commons are. They have no experience. But there are leftovers, and you'll be surprised sometimes. So I don't know the German situation, but in France they have the l'Association des sections communaux, and you will see that there are forests in the Pyrenees and rivers, and there's 100,000 members. They're still there. 1/3 of the land in Galicia is still a common. So the first thing to do is cartography. What are the traditional commons? And just talk about it and educate and write articles and just recreate that consciousness, that awareness. But the second thing is the urban commons, and I'm just absolutely 100% sure that you have them. It's just that you don't call them that way. But language is important. So I think if you want to get out of the labor capital way of thinking, then the commons language is actually very important. But unfortunately, we have to educate. We have to become stronger. We have to have media. We have to start connecting. But I think, connecting urban commons in Berlin, for example, would be a great thing to do. They're there. The urban gardens, the community-supported agriculture, the food purchasing groups, the energy co-ops, they're there, you have them. This is mutualization, pooling, commons. So what you suffer from is a lack of awareness, lack of self-consciousness, and fragmentation. Because you have no common language, things which actually have a common structure seem to be different. But they're the same. They all have an underlying structural logic. So somebody needs to do that work, and that's what the P2P Foundation does, at the global level. But you might want to do something like in Melbourne, which is the Commons Transition Coalition. Or you might want to do what's happening in France. They have a dozen of them, Assemblée des communs, Fabrique des communs, whatever the appropriate language is in German. I don't know German, I can tell you, but you have to start naming things and bringing people together who agree to name things. And if you look at, the socialist movement in the 19th century, working class didn't exist as such. These were farmers expelled from their land, coming in cities with no protection. And there's books about it, the history of the English working class from E.P. Thompson. It shows that people have to start naming themselves. Oh, I'm a worker. I'm not just an expelled farmer, because I'll never go back there. I'm actually a worker, right? And I need to protect myself. I need a union. I need a mutual. So now I think we need to step up, because labor has become by definition subordinate. Yeah, if you have a labor contract, you have a contract of subordination. This was a compromise between the unions and capital. Okay, you protect us, but we'll obey. Yeah, we get safety, but we obey. We don't challenge the system. And what I think is what we do is we need to think differently, not just fight within that system. As long as you keep fighting with your wife or your husband, if you have an unhappy marriage, you strengthen you're keeping the marriage alive. It's the moment when you turn away and say, this is not going to work. Then you have a chance to build a new relationship that works for you. So as long as we keep fighting the beast, paradoxically, we nourish the beast. What I'm suggesting is we are commoners, we are creating value ourselves, we create our markets, we try to transform the common good institutions, the state and the city, the way we need them to be. And we see ourselves as commoners. It's a consciousness. I am primarily a citizen in a community creating value with other human beings. I'm not a contractual worker. I'm not a precarious. I'm a commoner. Does that make sense? Sure. It's not derivative. Even, I use the word precarious, but I actually don't like it, because it says I'm weak. I'm dependent of capitalism. No, you're a commoner. You can be proud of it. Together you know everything, together you have everything. Once you realize that, you're actually not that precarious, because somebody will help you. So how do we recreate these connections? Yeah? How do we go from pre-modern collectivism, where everybody had a place but no freedom to choose, to individualistic, corporate identities, to I am somebody that I contribute to the common good. And I'm recognized by my other co-citizens. And when I say citizens, it's not meant to be exclusive. It's meant to be all the people who live in a place, right? I am co-creating value, like what the beautiful things you're doing here in the supermarket. Yeah, you're helping people rearrange their lives, rethink their lives, becoming, more dynamic in their entrepreneurial activities. That's what you're creating value. You're creating some kind of commons that needs to be named.
You just mentioned rearranging life. We talked about separation and connecting again and commons. So what is it doing, we talked on a systemic level, on the organization level, what does it do with the person themselves? Because we are observing more and more people still working this system, still working in these organizations, but they are burned out, they are bored out, they are dropping out. Yeah. So I don't know, maybe you want to start with your own process of change and transformation, and maybe how do you observe what's happening around you, and especially maybe if you share our observation, it's increasing. More and more people are going.
I think one of the underlying, of course, this crisis that motivates people, but there's also a very long-term evolution towards highly educated people. Yeah. So it took us 500 years in Europe to be educated, and now we have 70%. I don't know in Germany how much, but we have a really high number of people with education and higher needs. We have more complex needs. My father could be happy by having a job, knowing that his family was fed. Well, I cannot be satisfied with that. I am not. I need to do something that is meaningful. And so once society reaches that state, then that old subordinate labor system just is not working. Most of it is fake needs. It's harmful. So how can you be happy if you're thinking human being, if you're aware human being? How can you be happy doing that? So that's what happened to me. I saw the world going the wrong direction. More and more ecological destruction, climate change, more and more social inequality, the rise of the authoritarian right, but also especially how people inside the company were getting really sick. Like 15% burnout rates. And the HR department actually managing it so that it's kept within that boundary. As long as only 15% of the people are getting burnouts, we can live with it. And so I was thinking, like, am I part of the solution or part of the problem? And I felt I'm part of the problem. So you cannot have a happy life. Once you have these psychic and social needs, you cannot have a happy life. So that's one aspect, The second aspect, I think, is the vision of scarcity versus the vision of abundance. Now, I don't want to say that everything will be abundant in the future, but it's about, okay, if you are an individual competing with every other individual and you just have a nuclear family, life is tough. Nobody's helping you, right? If you're part of a community, extended family, affinity-based community, then suddenly you can say, well, I don't have it, but I don't need it because somebody else in my community can help me, like a drill. It's a silly example. It's used 8 minutes in a lifetime on average. Yeah, a car, 5%. We don't need all these things. We don't use them. So if by mutualizing these things, you can start thinking about life in a different way. Like, I don't have to have it. Well, I need to know where it is when I need it. Right? And I need a reciprocal relationship with a community or person that I know they can help me when I need it in that particular context. And that creates a relaxation in life. And that's what enclosure does with the commons. Like if you live as a medieval farmer and there's no fences, if you don't have it, somebody in your extended family will have it. I lived this in Thailand. My Thai wife, when we were precarious, food was coming in, so I didn't feel good about it, but, I wasn't starving. I knew that this was a backup system for me, right? And I think we need to recreate it in a different way from before, but we need to recreate this tissue of relationships. And I think the people will survive in the hard times that come, because I'm not an utopian. The resource scarcities will be real. Then we need to think about this. Okay, how do we mutualize? How do we diminish our footprint? How can we still keep the services, but at a much lower matter energy cost for the planet? And this requires pooling, communifying, mutualization, community. I would start thinking that way, like, where will I get my food? Where will we get the energy? But alone, unless you're rich, you can't do it. So it's collective. Like, where will we get our food? And join a collective purchasing group. Where will I get my lodging? Why join a co-op? This kind of...
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was already like the next question. So where to go next? Like what to do now? How to collaborate? How to bring it into politics? Or to do without politics, not just by doing it. Or like, so what would be the next steps more?
Well, I do think we need
strategic
politics,
thinking?
and the example I like to use, and maybe it's a wrong example because you will correct me, but I feel the way the Energiewende happened in Germany is a good example. So the first moment was one place, one village wanted to do a co-op, and they couldn't, and they fought for 5 to 10 years to actually have the right to the energy co-op. So politics matters. They had to fight, I can't remember what level, but there's a story about this, right? Then they won, and then you had, I don't know, 200-300 co-ops in the whole of Germany. This was only 2 or 3% of the country, of the production. Then you have a crisis moment, right? Fukushima and the Greens in the government, and they make a regulation, the feed-in tariff, that allow a minority model to become mainstream. Because this is important, the law is not made for us. There's many, many things you cannot do because it's all aimed at creating artificial scarcity. And I have a friend, General Orsi, from the Sustainable Economics Law Center. One day she said, it's illegal to collect rainwater. It's illegal to dry your clothes in the sun. It's illegal to put a garden in front of your house. And she gave a whole list of these things. Like, what, really? Yes, counties in the US do that, and we have the similar rules in Europe. Because it's a vision of individualism, yeah?
And the vision of dependency.
And a vision of dependency.
So, but how to break this, or how
Start on your own. Don't think you have to do everything by yourself. The thing is, like, there's a whole society changing. So do whatever is where you feel your energy and passion for, where you have skills, but connect with the others doing the other parts, right? So we can't change everything on our own, but choose the piece of the puzzle where you have a maximum contributory capacity, and that also gives you a maximum amount of happiness doing it. If we all do it, society will be changed.
Sounds like a perfect finishing word.
For me, it's a
If we all do it.
Thanks so much, Michel.
Yeah.